consider these sanctions completely unsubstantiated, unreasonable, and very detrimental to the bilateral relations between two neighbors, between the United States of America and the Russian Federation. They are bitter because they have to leave before their term expired. What happened is they have to leave within hours, and it's just not human, frankly, not human.
Reaction from a top Russian diplomat on the sanctions that President Obama unveiled yesterday. So let's talk about it with our panel. Tom Rogan, columnist for National Review and Opportunity Lives. Leslie Marshall, syndicated talk radio host, and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. Welcome to all of you. And there were a lot of people who thought that President Putin would unleash something very nasty in return. But here's a bit of his statement today. He said, as it proceeds from international practice, Russia has reasons to respond in kind. Although we have the right to retaliate, we will not resort to irresponsible kitchen diplomacy, but will plan our further steps to restore Russian-U.S. relations based on the policies of the Trump administration. By the way, he went on to tweet, Donald Trump, great move on delay by V. Putin. I always knew he was very smart. Exclamation point, Tom.
Yeah, look, I mean, the Russians, I actually thought they might over-retaliate and get the U.S. ambassador out of Moscow. But I think what they're doing here is quite simple. They think they can manipulate Trump because he's playing right into that at the moment. They will keep playing this game until there comes a pushback point, which they have not seen, frankly, under President Obama. And I think these expulsions represent that. Why didn't he persona non grata the ambassador if he wanted to show a really serious message? I found it quite amusing, though, that Russian Foreign Ministry statement, the Consul General, that's Russian humor, nothing else. That's a sign of profanity to President Obama, of disinterest. They were tweeting out a photo of a duck. Because the Russians do, any American diplomats or Western diplomats in Moscow or journalists, they do far worse, far more inhuman things than that, going into their apartments and leaving gifts of every measure.
Special packages.
Yes, exactly. And read between the lines.
Yeah, well, I thought it was interesting, too, Leslie, because the statement from President Putin went on to say, by the way, any diplomatic kids who are in Moscow right now, we invite you to the New Year's Eve party at the Kremlin. So is some of this tongue-in-cheek? What is this?
Yes, I think definitely. If President Obama were in his first term going into second, or if Hillary Clinton were coming in as president next year, I don't think we would have seen the same reaction and response from Putin and from Russia as we are. I agree. I think he looks at, well, I've got my buddy, which Democrats call his puppet, President-elect Trump coming in, so this is how I'm going to respond. I have to say, I think this is great that the president did this, but honestly, as a Democrat, I think he should have done it a long time ago. You know, I was looking at history with Russia today, and I was looking at not only hacking but spying. We executed a man and a woman in this country for spying. So, I mean, this is a serious offense. Even when Republicans and Democrats agree on something, we know there's a level of seriousness and severity, and I'm not surprised by Putin's response because, you know, next month it's a whole different ballgame for him.
It is, and there are questions tonight about the timing of what the Obama administration has done. Kellyanne Conway, who's going to be a senior advisor to the president, has been campaign manager to President Trump. Here is a bit of what she had to say about why now.
Even those who are sympathetic to President Obama on most issues are saying that part of the reason he did this today was to, quote, box in President-elect Trump. That would be very unfortunate if that were if politics were the motivating factor here, but we can't help but think that that's often true. Even the New York Times characterized it as such, that this may be an attempt to box him in to see what he'll do as president. That's not the way that peaceful transitions of administrations work in our great democracy.
Charles, how much do you think what President Obama did is about Putin versus being about Trump?
Well, I think it's both. It was a twofer for him, but I think it's become rather farcical. Putin is showing his complete contempt for Obama, the way he kind of laughs it off. He decides that this is so trivial, he isn't even going to retaliate, which is the normal thing you do. I love the way he invites American diplomatic kids to the Kremlin. I mean, what kid doesn't dream of a New Year's party at the Kremlin? What American kid doesn't? I mean, Trump, I think, has sort of played into it, and by congratulating Putin, but it's a smart move on the part of the Russians. You put no pressure on Trump, so you give him the option to drop the sanctions. But this is a complete distraction. These sanctions are meaningless. The only ones that matter, and even those sanctions are not that severe, are the ones that were imposed on Russia because of Ukraine. The two leading candidates for the French presidency next year are both opposed to those sanctions. Those sanctions are on their last legs, and that's, if you're worried about sanctions and Russian aggression, that's where the focus ought to be. These are going to be temporary sanctions on Russia for a few weeks. Maybe Trump will keep them, but as soon as they're in agreement on anything, some kind of trivial nuclear deal or something, the dropping of the sanctions will be a part of that, and this will be a distant memory.
Well, and Tom, what kind of situation does this create for incoming President Trump with, as Leslie noted, there is bipartisan support for taking more serious action against Russia, for potential special and select investigations into exactly what they did or didn't do with respect to the election. And now he walks in with praise of Putin, with saying it's time to move on with our lives. And he's going to have opposition on the Hill from both parties.
He's going to have opposition on the Hill, and it will create fraying because there's real anger on the Hill. But there's also real anger in the intelligence community, and there's concern on the part of Western allies. And if you link back to some of the things candidate Trump said about NATO, the Europeans are especially concerned, and potentially the UK is sort of offering this pivot to Trump to say, look, we'll try and get NATO to increase defense spending. But if he keeps doing these sort of tweets, playing Putin's game, because that's what it is, it's standard, manipulation. And if he keeps ignoring the intelligence briefings, the Russians think he's a joke, as a fact. They think he's a joke, and they think he's pliable. You're going to see degrading American credibility in the same vein, a sort of different version of President Obama's red line collapse, that American power is subject to the Kremlin, and more specifically subject to a KGB counterintelligence guy who never left the KGB.
Okay, so we have a late tweet from the president-elect today also saying Russians are playing CNN and NBC News for such fools, funny to watch. They don't have a clue. Then he goes on to add Fox News totally gets it. So, Leslie, if they think that he is a foolish puppet, is he also playing the game back at them with some reverse psychology? What's going on here?
No, I don't think that President-elect Trump is dumb. Okay, certainly he's made some very good business decisions that have certainly bode well for him. But I don't think he's as clever as Putin and his people in Russia, unfortunately. So no, I don't think, in a sense, he's bright enough to be, pulling that back, if you will. I think it's terrible that, regardless of who won, that anybody isn't concerned about this. And I think one of the reasons the president waited is there wasn't enough information. And I think that as president-elect, Donald Trump should care more about this country, because it's our election today. God forbid it's our nuclear codes tomorrow.
All right, panel, that's it on this. But we've got a lot to cover in the Friday Lightning Round, including some of your New Year's resolutions. So stick around.
The agreements that have been reached are, of course, fragile and need special attention and accompaniment for them to be preserved and developed. But nevertheless, it's a notable result of our joint work.
I would like to express the hope that when Donald Trump's administration comes on duty, they would also be able to join these efforts.
Chatter there about the Syrian ceasefire. We're back with our panel. Charles, I'll start with you because it's notable that the U.S. had nothing to do with the talks that led to the ceasefire, but Russian officials are now talking about bringing Trump into the fold once he's sworn in.
Continuing story of Russians showing their contempt for the Obama administration. We are not even invited to the talks that will be in Kazakhstan. In the past, when there was a dispute in the Middle East, the conferences were held in Washington or under the auspices of the U.S. We aren't even there. Look, the most important thing here is that this ceasefire, to the extent that it holds, is not a result of clever diplomacy. It's what the Romans called the peace of the grave. The rebels were dealt such a huge defeat in Aleppo. They are in no position to carry on the fight in the same way as before. This is a Russian victory. The mantra out of this administration always was, you can't solve a civil war militarily. The answer is you can.
Well, and Leslie, there are some notable terror factions that are not part of this ceasefire as well.
Yes, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, or the Al-Qaeda branch in Syria. And as you know, that's a part of the problem. I mean, if you look at the map of Syria, that's almost a third a part of the problem geographically. And it plays into this almost 6-year civil war, which has led to the millions of refugees that have left Syria. Look, we had 16 airstrikes that came from Assad's military today. I don't call that much of a ceasefire. And I'm not trying to be a pessimist, but even Putin just said that this is fragile at best. So I'm not, look, the United States says this is a move in the positive move in the right direction. I'm not sure how much of a positive move that is, because even though you have some Islamic organizations that are sitting at this table, two that caused a lot of problems and murder among the Syrian people, are not there and are going to continue to wreak havoc in this region.
Tom, how does the Trump administration address Syria?
Well, we talk about credibility. This is on the ceasefire is a joke. It plays on Russia and Syria. Beware Russians bearing gifts, because simply the rebellion, if the moderate rebellion collapses, that force gravitates to Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, the Al-Qaeda syndicate, and ISIS. It doesn't go away. The Russians know that. You know, how does it work with President Trump coming in? Well, he has two options, I think. He either pushes back against the Russians or he accepts it and gets it done. And frankly, that's better than doing what we're doing now. The problem becomes for Trump, who's talking about credibility, if you acquiesce Syria, the Sunni monarchies, which are traditional American allies, will gravitate towards funding Salafi extremists, because they will never accept Assad, and they will never accept the notion that it's Assad or ISIS. So it's this... it's going to get very messy, I think, very quickly.
All right, I want to make sure that we get to economy, our next topic in this lightning round. Here's a bit of what Steve Moore had to say. He's been an advisor, economic advisor to the Trump campaign about why the markets have been responding so well to his election.
I think people are looking at the tax cuts that are coming. I think people are looking at the regulatory reforms, the pro-growth energy policy, and they're saying this is going to be a president who takes growth and business seriously. And I think that's why you've seen, you know, this dramatic increase in the Dow Jones.
And we could put up a look at the Dow, how it's done this year and how it's done since the election. Quickly, Tom, your thoughts on whether Trump can take credit for this or if it's just part of the natural cycle?
I think partly he can. I think more that's about this relative stability that he's brought into office. But look, the fundamentals, regulation, I think, is a big thing. People are the business community is very excited about that, the reduction in regulation. But other things, the productivity collapse, the skills gap that we still have, labor participation rates, those are things that are much more difficult, much more structural, and things that, you know, I've brought 8,000 jobs back. That ain't enough. So we shall see. The devil will be in the details.
Leslie, a lot of work to do on Capitol Hill as far as addressing some of these economic issues that Tom pointed out.
Yeah, and I think also some truth. The reality is that Donald Trump has thousands of jobs overseas, which he personally could bring to the United States if he closed his production plants in Mexico and China, Bangladesh, India, as an example. President Obama has brought and created 9.3 million jobs. So when somebody is touting 8,000 jobs, which we haven't seen yet, and on December 6th, the Sohn company said 50,000 jobs, and now we're talking about 5,000 out of that 50,000. I just think these are tweets, and again, I have to see the creation to believe it. I, as an American, want our country to succeed. I want jobs to, come back to the United States, but the president-elect could do that right now with a phone call.
Well, some pessimists had predicted a plunge of the markets. That's definitely not what we've seen so far. There appears to be some optimism. All right, we got to get through this. So, Charles, I want to start with your winners and losers for 2016.
My loser, well, obviously it was Hillary, but that's too obvious. I'd go with Christie. He went for the brass ring. He not only didn't get it, he not only was boxed out, he was humiliated. This is a very bad ending for a guy who, at one point, was the only one who stepped over the line to embrace Trump. The winner, of course, other than Trump, Vladimir Putin, Crimea in his pocket, Eastern Ukraine, sanctions are collapsing. We were supposed to have isolated him. He's isolated us. And now he's the king of the Middle East. That's a pretty good record for a guy who started out with a very weak hand.
All right, Leslie, yours.
My winner is, unfortunately, fake news. I mean, when you have Pizzagate trending and people actually believing that, it's a sad statement that fake news was winning over truth and real news. Losers, maybe those of us who were subject to believing the fake news, but pollsters. They had it wrong across the board, every which way. And that's it.
It was a tough year for them. Tom, yours?
Yeah, my winner is John McLaughlin, my mentor in the McLaughlin Group. He started the show as a sort of rancorous shouting match, but as it came to the end, our ratings very interesting going through, very strong, quite a traditional set, sort of more geriatric. I was the younger element, but there was a great passion from across the political spectrum, I think, because we debated and respect each other, and that perhaps is something that hopefully could be taken forwards. My losers are millennials. Millennials have a big problem because entitlement reform is off the radar. That affects us very deeply in terms of prospective interest rate increases, and, the net interest repayments on the debt. But also another example would be Obamacare. Obamacare has dramatically driven up healthcare costs for young people, and because this is not on the agenda, this deficit spending track, then what are we to think? I think the future is slightly bleak for us.
All right, each of you has about 5 seconds to tell me about a New Year's resolution. Charles.
I'm staying out of the candidate casino for 2.5 years, but because the vow doesn't take effect till midnight, I'll put $20 on Cuomo in 2020.
Oh, all right. You heard it here first, Leslie.
Personally, spend more time with my kids and be a better mom. And as an American, hoping to work for unity. I would like some unity in this country.
All right.
Yeah, I think that would be extension. I'd like to get the McLaughlin Group back going again, but I'd also like for an expansion of good, polite, but firm debate in the country. That barroom mentality, which I think is good. In the UK, you couldn't do that because people would fight, but here there's, energy.
I've seen a few fights this year, but we will all hope for unity, a lot of kumbaya in 2017.